It's a little bit of an oxymoron to call it new archetypes because archetypes are archetypal and historic and accepted, but I think the idea of experimenting with archetypes is a principle that I've sort of come to appreciate over the years of my practice. And also the principle of the civic ideal that I think is a really important reminder to everybody working in the built environment and architects especially, that I think we should consider all of our work civic. There's no such thing as a building that's not appreciated by the public, whether it's a house or housing or commercial office building. All architecture contributes to the public realm. And the facades as well as the ground plane, because I think there's a confusion between the public realm being horizontal, but I think the public realm is also vertical. And so the way we read architecture and the way we use it and the way it can adapt over time, these ideals and the values that come with civic architecture, I think, apply to all typologies. I practice mainly in the UK. This is a very funny world map because the UK is really big and North America is really small, and Europe. But primarily I work in around London, Cambridge, Oxford, and Bath. And I'm doing a very big project in Vancouver at the moment. And I've exhibited at the Venice Biennale, which I'm going to talk about down here. Designed a hotel in Germany and various competitions in Eastern Europe. I'm originally from Canada. I moved to London in 1988, so I've been there a very long time, more time in the UK than in Canada, but I found London in particular a really amazing place to live and to practice, and it's incredibly huge. This is just a fragment of it that you can see from the map, but one of the most significant things for me about London is its urban structure. It's organic. There are moments of Renaissance or Enlightenment grids and axes, but primarily it's an organic city, and it's remarkable for its public spaces, which you can see here. It's open green spaces, parks and squares. And in a way, for me, the London Square is an archetype. It's a format that was invented in pretty much the 17th and 18th century as a kind of developer's model to attract residents to their developments. And so it had a kind of commercial incentive, but it's become a very important aspect of the public realm and the civic realm as it moved from being private to being public. This is Bedford Square in London. The Architectural Association is here. And what's we all know about the Georgian terraced houses of London is that these have all been pretty much converted into offices, into university buildings, into labs, every possible use. And it kind of demonstrates the adaptability of housing and the way housing itself forms the kind of infrastructure and cultural infrastructure of the city. Another really important building for me in London, or archetype, is Somerset House. And for those of you who've spent time in London, you'll know that Somerset House is an amazing kind of cultural hub. But it started out, it is the world's first example of a purpose-built mixed-use building. And so it started out as a site for government offices, Royal Academy, Royal Society of Antiquaries, a tax office, the Navy Board. It was a kind of mix of uses, but the concept, William Chambers' concept in 1780 was a series of townhouses around a quadrangle. So the actual architectural concept was townhouses. So it was originally conceived as various townhouses with lots of entrances framing this amazing square. And it's adapted over time to be an incredible cultural center for London. Now has a Courtauld Institute, King's College, Somerset House galleries, music festivals, film, skating, and now it has a makerversity. So the basement stories of Somerset House are now studios for designer makers. So To me, it just exemplifies the amazing robustness, but also generosity and adaptability of the quadrangle as an archetype. I chose to celebrate 21 years of my practice at Somerset House and stage an exhibition and a video and lectures. And so these are the embankment galleries at Somerset House, and all of the models, or many models from my practice were mounted there. And it was really wonderful to be able to use Somerset House for that celebration. And I chose that moment to publish a book, a kind of catalog representing 21 years of practice. And I called it Ideals Then Ideas. And I felt it was important at that kind of moment in my practice to really declare the ideals that I stand for as an architect. And there's an essay in it where I describe the 4 principal ideals of my practice being authenticity, generosity, civicness, and beauty. This was, I guess, 3 years ago when I wrote that, and it was kind of radical to talk about beauty. As a good modernist, educated, you know, with the sort of great tomes of modernist ideology governing my thinking, it took me a long time to actually even use the word beauty when I describe anything, really, because it was kind of amoral, I think, in the modernist view. But I actually decided at a certain point that we as architects, as a profession, should be delivering beauty. We should be telling our clients that we stand for beauty, and we will do everything we can to make the environment more beautiful. And generosity and authenticity and civicness, I think, are also part of beauty, and they're all reciprocal. So in the book, I actually organized my work into thematic groups, and some focusing on the different things I've explored in my projects: assembly, folding, unfolding, hybridism, etc., etc. But one of them is archetypes, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So back to the London Square, Bedford Square, and Gower Street, which is next door. Again, the principle of the Georgian terraced house as being a kind of incredible typology that's adapted over time, and one associates most of London's great neighborhoods with the typology of the Georgian terraced house. And a lot of the work I've done in housing in the last few years has been addressing some of the, well, it's estate regeneration. It's addressing some of the problems of post-war construction that happened in the UK, where big areas of the city fabric were either bombed or just demolished in slum clearance schemes. And now in London, they're starting to correct and repair and rebuild these kind of utopian experiments that happened in the post-war era. So this is a piece of London that's called the South Kilburn Estate. It's in northwest London. And the local authority, the London Borough of Brent, has commissioned a master plan for the whole area in 2005, divided the whole place up into about 15 phases, and for every phase of the estate regeneration, they stage a competition, a very quick invited competition for about 200 units of housing, and they always want at least 2 architects on the competition teams. So I've done 3 of these competitions over the year, well, 4 I think, and won 3 with partners. And so this is Ely Court up here, Bronte and Fielding House down here, and Durham Gloucester Court here. So the whole estate was kind of like this, sort of buildings scattered around a green landscape, and then streets removed. You can see in this image the kind of texture of 19th century London and its streets and squares that were preserved, and then the kind of 1950s and 60s interventions that basically have become no man's land. The buildings turn their backs on the street, and nobody ever goes in these places unless they live there. So they create these kind of ghettos, which are socially segregated. And this is kind of what they look like, many of them, because they removed the street network and put in pedestrian zones, they become very unsafe. The quality of construction is very low, and there hasn't been the budgets to maintain these places. So a lot of what we do is about sort of restoring the street itself. And so in terms of the site I was working on at Ely Court, that sort of green area with diagonal buildings, the sort of first step was to restore the street with a terrace, to break the terrace, to acknowledge the 1950s building, which was to remain, to create a garden square, introduce a new Muse Street, to connect the estate and its residents to other parts of the locale, and then to introduce 3 typologies, each with frontages overlooking the public spaces of the city, like a normal neighborhood street. And so this typology is the London Mansion Block, which some of you may know. It's a typology where you have cores you have a core with no corridor, so you have units on either side of the core, and on the upper stories you have through units. And so there are lots of cores, lots of entrances, and this one has duplexes on the ground floor. So it's relatively simple terraces that frame these spaces and define fronts and backs in a very straightforward way. And really what I try to work with is a simple palette of materials, brick that relates to the historic London stock brick, recessed balconies that create shade and privacy and protection from the rain, 2-story porches that announce a duplex house, so front door in the street, and then these are the communal entrances that take you to the upper stories. In an image like this, my buildings kind of disappear, which I consider to be a success, because the whole idea of estate regeneration is to kind of normalize what's been a sort of experimental and isolated and alienated place. And so simply by restoring and restructuring the terrace in a contemporary way, it starts to reintegrate these communities back into the neighborhood. And they're a mix. That's another principle I should say, is that in London all new housing projects are tenure blind. So the social housing and the private market housing all is identical. So this building here, for example, is social rent, and this building here is market sale, but they all have the same brick, the same high ceilings, 2.6 meter high ceilings, French doors, inset balconies. The same standard runs across affordable and private sale. And this is the kind of quality of space you get with inset balconies that create the sense of another room in the home. And there's certain rules I work to, like I always use French doors. I never do punched windows. Windows for me always have to go to the floor. Ceilings always have to be 2.6 meters high. And those kind of rules that you set for yourself basically set up the proportional system for your facades, for your fenestration, and really the streetscape. So this is why I feel there's a really intimate relationship between things like spatial proportions and window types and the public realm, because those elements are framing our communal public space. And then just briefly, we did another project down here that used to have tower slab blocks on it, on a parking podium, and we've built a mansion block. This is a 6-story mansion block with double height balconies, and this vertical expression was really intended to respond to the Gothic church in the distance, to create a good streetscape, and to kind of break down the scale. So again, the same rules: French doors, dormer windows, sheltered balconies. And these are the kinds of, this is another little building we did behind the one you just saw. That's a kind of point block with a central core and inset balconies that become rooms that are kind of a folding of the facade into the building that make the units feel much bigger. And these are social rent, and they they have 3-meter high ceilings on the top floor. So we try to sneak in these really nice things into our housing projects that actually the council really supports, because they want really high quality housing for the future. They own the land, and they sell it to developers on a 125-year lease, and then they enforce the planning design so it can't be dumbed down during construction. So basically the council acts as our client up to planning. And I think that's a really good model. It's a win-win model, because the local authority has all of their demands met in terms of mix and unit numbers and tenure, and the design quality is the vision comes through the competition, and then both sides work to a planning consent, and then the contractor just has to build what has planning consent. So it's a very streamlined, risk-free process that actually guarantees a good result. We're also working for developers. This is the Greenwich Peninsula. It's kind of like a city for 150,000 people that's being built there by a Hong Kong developer, master plan by Alison Morrison. And you know, they're trying to achieve a kind of super high density, but with grain and character. And we were asked to do a block with 400 units on it, so very high density. And so I looked at really, there's not much context in Greenwich. It's empty except for the power station and its chimneys. So the kind of Victorian wrought iron language of brick and riveted, really amazing ironwork from the Victorian era. And then really trying to make a piece, a composition of elements that are tapered, that feel connected to the ground, where you feel gravity, a monolith of carved forms, and that these are articulated with kind of grillage of metal loggias. So these are continuous loggias that run across the front of the towers and the sides, and they're slightly tapering. And so the principle is that they kind of evoke the past. They also evoke some quite notable towers in Chicago, the Hancock building in Chicago, but really the tapering is about alleviating the density and bringing light into the block. So at the other end of the spectrum, I also do cultural projects, and one of them is for York Castle. York is an ancient city in the north of England, and it's famous for its cathedral. It was a seat of power for kings for a few centuries. And here on the right, you can see a little collection. I mean, it's not much of a castle compared to what you have here, I can say, without doubt. But there are fragments of what was York Castle that used to be a fortified enclosure, and this is the motte called the Clifford's Tower. And then there are 3 18th century buildings on the site and a huge parking lot. And we entered a competition last year to design a master plan for the museum and its 3 buildings, and to kind of create a new identity for the center of the city of York. I mean, we do a lot of research and digging into the history of the place, and we realized that the castle, there was never really a castle there. There was a castle wall, and there was a motte, and there were little outbuildings. And then in the 19th century, they built a prison, and then these are the 18th century buildings here and a 19th century building here. And today, it looks like this. So there are the 3 18th century buildings and then a huge car park. And all of the walls of the castle have been taken down except for this piece here. And this is actually a functioning courthouse. So it's one of these scenarios where you hear about York Castle and its museum, and then when you arrive, you just are presented with a horrible car park, and you can't really find the castle or the museum. It really suffers from a lack of identity, and then this is what you see when you come. Sort of in the distance, there's a little sort of 1970s thing there that's in front of the wall. That's the castle wall. So you can see it's a problematic place. And this is the beginning of a very long history of evolution of the site. I think the next slide has even more sort of archaeological maps that show the castle in around 1600, when it had all its walls and a gate, and then over time it sort of reads like this, is gradually eroded with a few new buildings added, and then it becomes this emptied out kind of place. So my instinct was to think about how to kind of get back to this scenario where your approach to the museum would be through a gateway, a kind of compressive space rather than an open space, and that the whole new museum quarter would read as a new piece of city. So this is the kind of contrast. That's the original contained space with its motte, and then the new completely empty and kind of void space. This is our scheme at the competition stage, which basically proposed to introduce a new building here at the kind of threshold to the site, because the center of the city is here, to create this sense of approach through a gate and through walls. And we positioned the building right on top of where the old gate and gatehouse was originally. And then this building acts as a threshold to what was a female prison here, the 18th century female prison. It's now a museum of the city of York called Kirkgate, and then the debtors' prison, which has cells, and this is the courthouse. So there's a kind of grim history to all of these places, but it's a very, very popular tourist destination. And with the motte here, it starts to create this sense of a contained space that has a kind of ordering system. And this was one of the inspirations for the form of our building was really the motte itself, and this sort of the geometry of a fortification, a kind of panoramic, multi-sided, biaxially symmetrical form that we distorted and manipulated to actually address the geometry of the site. Here you can see the kind of scale and the sense of compression we were trying to achieve with our building that in itself acts as a kind of gate. And so this would be the approach from the city. So where you saw the car park before, there's a new kind of gate building that invites you through its walls into its spaces, and from there you commence your journey through the museum. And it has a big central atrium. It's not a huge museum, but it has this intention of demonstrating the history of the evolution of the Castle of York as a very open public space. On the ground floor, we propose to expose the archaeology of the two gate towers under the floor. And then on the upper floors, there's temporary exhibitions and then education spaces on the top floor. And the building acts as a kind of window onto the Eye of York. And there are moments where we've captured very particular views of the castle, trying to create a sense of connection. Again, the kind of panoramic outlook of the watchtower of the motte. And then the debtors' prison, we've proposed a very delicate pavilion to create a sheltered entrance that evokes the yard, the prisoner's yard, that was once there. This is the place where you saw the entrance to the museum at the beginning. So all of that infill from the 1980s we propose to remove so that visitors can appreciate the wall and actually go through the wall to the river. And this is a kind of delicate way of bringing people up to the castle wall, and we're reinstating a walkway along the castle walk. So it's a kind of multifaceted project that, again, it's made of stone, York stone, so it's kind of like the circular geometry of the Eye of York emerges from the landscape to create this frame and a great balcony overlooking the square. And this is a view looking north. it's a difficult challenge to sort of negotiate between the sort of 18th century neoclassical architecture, the castle architecture, but we're trying to find a language that actually responds to the geometry, but also the proportions and material of the site, but also to try to capture the sort of sublime aspect of the castle walls that were once there, and the kind of, in a way, the romance, the romantic ideal that people have when they think of castles. So those are all kind of projects, but this is actually a built work that I'm going to show you now, which is another kind of translation of an archetype, and it's a new collegiate campus for Exeter College in Oxford. As I'm sure you all know, Oxford has an amazing legacy, architectural legacy. Christopher Wren, Hawksmoor, Gilbert Scott, incredible neo-Gothic architecture and neoclassical architecture. And Exeter College is one of these ancient colleges right at the heart of the city. And like most colleges, it's completely trapped in a kind of heritage listed environment, and it can't adapt any of its buildings to contemporary standards because they're all listed. And it really wants to expand its capacity to accommodate students, because the model of Oxford and its colleges is that they are a teaching and living environment. So fellows and students live together in a quadrangle, and that collegiate relationship between the fellows, who are here, some of them who are life fellows, and students is very intimate. It's actually represented by the quadrangle itself. On the left is sort of an old map of Oxford, and there you can see that the morphology of the city itself is made of quadrangles, and each one of these quadrangles, or clusters of them, represents a college. So that will be like King's College and Trinity College and Jesus College, and each one has its own quad. And so Exeter College has this, and then because this is full, they had to find a site for its additional population, and they found a site here for their new quad. And it's on the border of Worcester College, which is here, and Jericho Artisans District here. I was invited, it was a two-stage competition, 2011, to do this project, and we made it into the shortlist and won the competition. And as I've said earlier, we always do quite a lot of research at the outset of our projects. And you know, one of the key identifiable things of Oxford colleges is the language of their roofs and the roof line, which evolve over time. Quads are normally made up of different heights and sizes of buildings. The buildings are normally one bedroom deep, and Exeter College has an incredible legacy of neo-Gothic architecture. This is the chapel by George Gilbert Scott, and it's one of the most beautiful examples of neo-Gothic architecture in the UK. The competition site, on the other hand, kind of suffered from this building, which was built in 1913, Edwardian Baroque building, built with Ruskin, John Ruskin, as its namesake. So Ruskin College, which was built as a college for working men. So it was one of the first colleges in Oxford that invited working men rather than the sort of elite colleges. So while we were doing the planning design for this project, the building was listed. So we had to work with it. We sort of knew we would always have to work with it because of its historic significance, its social communal value. It was the site of the very first sort of social justice movements in the UK. Working with that as a kind of legacy was part of the project. And here's the kind of brief. They're very complex buildings, Oxford colleges, because they incorporate everything from teaching rooms and seminar rooms to auditoriums, music practice rooms, archive, study bedrooms, apartments, common rooms, kitchens. And then we added cloisters and a social learning space to our proposals at the competition stage. And this is a series of diagrams that we produced in the sort of first stage of the competition, where they asked for a kind of one-page synopsis of how we would approach the project. And so these series of diagrams were really just to illustrate that we would consider, or we normally consider, you know, many different possibilities for any particular site. It's only 25 meters wide and 75 meters long, so a very tight site. But the idea was that the quad itself can take many different formats. And what we ended up proposing was the S-shaped quad. So the existing building was more or less that typology, and we proposed this, which offers a courtyard to the south, a courtyard to the north, and created a potential new space in the middle, which we developed into the social learning space for the quad, which is Oxford's first social learning space. So this is the kind of diagrammatic principle, the Porter's Lodge and entrance, which connects to the central social learning space and a destination at the end, which is the auditorium. We described it as a three-dimensional ambulatory, so it creates a continuous sequence of walks and passages that are part of the narrative aspect of the project. The other driving idea was that every space in the building would be a place of gathering. So it's about encouraging relationships and chance encounter. So to create these connection spaces, I proposed these cloisters, one of which is a convex ellipse. The profiles, the shape, the spatial form created by these timber profiles is that convex ellipse, and then the north cloister is a concave ellipse, and these two cloisters lead to the auditorium and connect all the buildings. And so the S-shaped quad takes this form as a kind of new typology in the Oxford context. And here in section you can see the sort of developed plan, the S shape here, which really consists of teaching rooms connected by this cloistered space, an amphitheater, a multi-level central learning commons space, more teaching rooms, another cloister, the north quad, and the auditorium. And it's at the point, the social space is at the point of maximum circulation in the building to really encourage students to see each other and meet each other and get out of their rooms, because students cloistered away in their rooms and not engaging with other people is one of the problems in Oxford. And we extended the building conceptually into the roof space and treated this as an opportunity to create a new language for the building. And so this is the cloisters are glazed, so, or the south one is glazed, so you get many different qualities of light during the day. This is a kind of early study, the Rhino model, screen grab, while we're developing the language of the roof. And the idea was to express the roof as a single piece of metal that is cut and folded, and it creates a kind of cloak that wraps over the building. And so the idea was to bring a kind of softness and an expression that's more domestic and more expression of embrace than the traditional ecclesiastical roof typology, which is all about spires and pointing towards God. This one is more about the idea of a cloak. And so this language of radiused and curved roofs also helps the building step down in scale from very, really 6 stories at its highest with a new basement, and then down to the single-story auditorium. And so it takes on a playful character with this section where it flips up to catch the sun from the south. And then the other key element of the roof is its pattern and its iconography, which is the checkerboard stainless steel cladding, which gives the building an identity that relates to the leaded spire of the college's Turl Street quad. And so this is, at the competition stage, the kind of effect that you get when you intersect orthogonal windows with a curved roof. You get these kind of, this automatic amazing shape that's a byproduct of the geometry. And this is just to really demonstrate the complexity of the building. So this is the basement level where there's a cafe, archive, special collections archive. Anne Boleyn's diaries are in there, and all sorts of amazing artifacts, cafe and service spaces. That's the ground floor, the teaching rooms in pink. Again, the social learning space, practice rooms, back of house, the auditorium. Then one layer of student rooms, and all of the floors have a communal family kitchen, another place where students can meet each other and cook, and actually they study a lot in those family kitchens. Another floor of student rooms, and then up under the roof, those are fellows teaching rooms in pink, and then the final envelope. So it's really quite a complex stacking of elements. The floor plans I won't go through, but you can see the sort of S-shaped plan gradually reduces as you move up the building. And this is the competition stage render or planning stage render, where you can see the diamond pattern. And this was really inspired by the latticed spire of the Turl Street Quad of Exeter College, which is here in the distance. And that sort of gives the building a new identity, but also echoes its forebear. We spent about a year and a half doing planning consultations and had to write so many documents. It's unbelievable, including over here a book where we had to describe a history of the evolution of roofs in Oxford from the 11th century to the present day, to justify our approach and our sort of radical design for our roof. And here are images of the roof tiles being fabricated in Enfield in London. We had to do one-to-one mock-ups. And then the site, you can see it's a complete demolition of the site with the facade retained of Ruskin College, the concrete frame going up after the basement, the auditorium structure, which is glue laminated timber. One of the reasons I chose metal shingles for the roof is because it's one of the few places where you find real craftsmanship in architecture. Building craft in metalwork is still a skill, a very special skill. And so because William Morris is actually a graduate of Exeter College and also a student of Ruskin, having a roof that's made that expresses that craftsmanship, I felt was an important element of the story of the building. So here's the roof, the kind of new building that sort of emerges out of the top. The facade is still a little bit under construction here, but you can see how the new building emerges and steps down the street to create lower elements. And so the journey, the narrative of the building starts at the entrance hall, and this is the emblem of Ruskin College over the arch. But when you enter the building, it's an entirely new experience, and you're drawn both down and into the cloister, but you can also see the south courtyard. And this is the Porter's Lodge, one of 3 stairs that goes up to the upper floors, the pigeonholes. Because the cloister's glazed, the light changes all the time, and the leaves are moving, so it's a very dynamic quality of space. We worked with really wonderful graphic designers to do the signage. The material palette for the whole building is really just concrete, stone, cherry wood, and brass, and that's about it. We really tried to limit the materials. The glue lam is spruce. But this is a seminar room behind one of the retained facades. And then the building opens up into the learning commons. And so this is a kind of informal social space on many levels, which is really important in my view, that study spaces and education spaces are no longer enclosed, that you can see rooms before you move in. The idea of open planning, but providing spaces that are intimate and open, really it's about choice. this space is multi-level, it's on 4 levels. This is looking towards the south, and this is the cafe below. There's a kind of triple height space. And then even the corridors at the lower level are all used as study spaces. So the idea is there's nowhere in the building that's just a pure circulation space. And these are windows made by the workshops of William Morris, stained glass windows that announce the archive in the basement. And then this is the north cloister, which is concrete and has a completely different quality of light because it's north facing. And the reception area for the auditorium, and the auditorium itself, which has this exuberant roof structure. Really, it's about creating a sense of space on a very limited site. And because this building acts as a kind of jewel building in the north quad, you can look back towards the main social space, and it sort of reads in a similar way to the Gilbert Scott Chapel in the old quad. And that's the roof structure. Again, the north cloister, walking back. And the staircases are also really important to encourage students to use the stairs. They need to be beautiful things, and so they're just steel stairs with timber cladding and brass handrails. And all the corridors have a window at the end, so you never go into a corridor that doesn't have a view out. And so you're constantly sort of experiencing and seeing the city in different ways as you move through the building. And this is the family kitchen I pointed out earlier on. So at the crux of the building, there are these rooms that are glazed that have study tables and eating tables in them, and students can work and study. And this is a typical student room under one of the curved roofs on the left, and then on the right, one of the sort of fellow studies at the upper level. So the building offers many different qualities and perspectives because of its planned form. The fellow studies up under the roof, they also look into the quads, and they're sort of, I consider them, or they were intended to be destination spaces. So if you create really beautiful spaces for students to have their tutorials in, sort of at the top of the building, in the tree canopy, they're more likely to come to their tutorial. And these are very lucky tutors who have their offices up there. And so this is the scheme. And so you can see the way it's, well, the volume step and this kind of primary expression of a shimmering kind of iridescent metal skin that actually takes on the colors of the sky throughout the day. So this was a kind of radical thing to put through or to get through planning in Oxford, but now it's kind of set a new precedent, and lots of more expressive and curvaceous, maybe, buildings are starting to appear in the Oxford landscape because of this, the kind of steps that this building took. So I think this is the last project I'm going to talk about. It's an archetype in my mind because it is an urban tower, and it does, it's part of the kind of evolution of the city as we know it. All cities, even historic European ones, are densifying and they're going up. It's an inevitable trend. But King's Cross is a really exemplary model in London. Well, I think not even London, I think worldwide in terms of urban regeneration. And here it is, it's the red circle, that's the Euston Road, and it was formerly rail yards. St. Pancras Station on the left and King's Cross Station on the right, and up until the 1960s, really, it was a coal and goods depot, and it's really transformed in the last 20 years, a little bit due to the Olympics happening, but then just as a huge urban regeneration project. And so, again, a master plan where every site on this master plan has gone to an invited competition. So the developer, joint venture, Argent, they stage a limited design competition for every site. And this has produced some really interesting buildings, conversion of the granary, a huge new public square. That's a Chipperfield building. There's Eric Perry buildings. There's Google headquarters. It's a really diverse and really high quality new piece of London. And so that's Granary Square, this really wonderful new place. And this is Coldrops Yard, which is a Heatherwick scheme. This is before the Heatherwick scheme. It's very different now. I won the competition for this site here at the top of the park. So it's a kind of important void space at the moment because it's empty right on axis at the top of the park. And then from the south, there's a kind of busy road and there's a gap in the kind of urban fabric. Because it's in this right at the top of the master plan and with its sort of back to Camden and York Way, I really felt that this was an opportunity to introduce the kind of iconic language of King's Cross to the kind of farthest reach of the master plan and to explore the language of arches and of brick arches, not only of King's Cross, but also St. Pancras Station, which is another Gilbert Scott building, the same architect who did the chapel at Exeter College. So all of these connections between these historic buildings and their architects, they kind of permeate everywhere you work, or everywhere I work, at least, in London. And I love St. Pancras Station. It's just the most amazing building, also since it's been converted with the Eurostar terminal. So these are test models we did at the competition stage, trying to basically get 160 units into a very awkward shaped site and really create a new language and identity to draw people to the top of the park. And you can see the site here is a kind of pentagon. It's a very tricky site, and it also doesn't really, it has a front here and a front onto a square here and a front onto a square here. So a multi-sided building which we developed as a kind of quadrangle tower. And the master plan massing sort of stipulated an envelope, something like that. There's 2 tube lines running under the site. This process of carving away at the building, which is kind of the way I like to approach architecture, is that you start with a kind of maximum envelope and then you carve and kind of reveal the forms within and create sort of building blocks that are the right depth and aspect and orientation. And you can see here the emergence of a colonnaded base. And so the idea was to create a kind of cityscape with this one block that when you unwrap it, creates a cityscape. Yeah, so these are the competition stage renderings, so kind of impressionistic, but trying to actually create this sense of a very permeable and inviting threshold that creates a new identity for the top of the master plan. And the arches kind of migrate up the building to become a crown. And so in a way, like, I acknowledge the fact that I'm working with a kind of picturesque, you know, the building is not made of arches. Obviously, we're using contemporary prefabrication technology to make the building, but the language is important and the expressive possibilities are also important. So you can see the way the building wraps around a central courtyard where there's water. It's really dense. All developments in London work with the London Housing Design Guide, minimum space standards, 2 beds, 3 beds, 1 beds. And there are affordable, they're called pocket living units at the back of the main tower. So it has social affordable dwellings within it, as well as really spectacular market sale dwellings. And these are some of the details and ways that we've been developing, sort of evolving the language. It took a very long time. There are many, many different ways to make a brick arch, and so we ended up, you know, the placement of the voussoirs is, we tested so many different arrangements and then started to work with ventilation panels and infill panels to work with false perspective and really, in a playful way, amplify the language of the arch. And there are Bezier arches as well. They're a very particular kind of arch geometry. So this is the final scheme, which you can see attempts to kind of negotiate the site, the strange geometry of the site. It started out as open at the back, and now it's enclosed to make this courtyard. These are some of our arch tests. And this is the final scheme. Basically is also about the journey in a way. As you approach the building from the park, you are drawn through its main entranceway towards its courtyard. I mean, I feel a little bit self-conscious talking about arches in this city of arches, where you have arches everywhere and they're amazing. But architects, I think, have just started to rediscover the expressive potential and geometric potential of arches and cross vaults and vaults and all of these amazing things you can do. And so, you know, opportunities to create really fluid and dynamic spaces with these arches. This is a view, a kind of early view of the central courtyard. I like to show some images in black and white so you don't get distracted by the color, and just, you know, depending on the radius and geometry of the arch, you can achieve sort of different effects, also with mirrors. And then this is the one of the other facades of the building as it addresses a smaller square. And then around the back, because the lower, this piece of the building has to stay because it's spanning above the tube line, it can't take a lot of weight. What I really like about this piece here is that it kind of evokes the viaducts, the brick viaducts that run through London, and the arches that are all around King's Cross that are sort of occupied by studios and makers. And so it starts to read as a piece of infrastructure. These are the marketing images that you can tell for some of the units, which actually have the same windows as the social housing I do in Kilburn. So the French doors and the fan lights and the 3-meter high windows, I do those whether they're estate regeneration or central London, you know, really high end. And this is the foyer space, and we have used mirrors on opposite each other in the foyer, so as you walk through the foyer you get the sense of an infinite colonnade. And this is the courtyard at night. I think what this and my other residential projects are aiming for is this sense of being more or less an urban building that starts out as housing, but it can adapt over time because it has a kind of robustness and a kind of a pragmatism that means it can adapt to different uses, but also a kind of identity that speaks of its place. Maggie's is a very special commission in the UK. You may have heard of them, the Cancer Caring Centres, which are special commissions where Charles Jenks and his wife, Maggie Keswick-Jenks, who died of cancer, created this charity that would commission and design and build amazing buildings, sort of refuges or sanctuaries for people who've been diagnosed with cancer. These sanctuaries are all built on a hospital site, so they're on the hospital grounds. So, and they're non-clinical, they're places where people who've been diagnosed can go and get therapy, have counseling, get advice, do yoga, have cooking classes. But they're very much designed as a kind of house, like a home. You're being invited to somebody's home, and there are literally no signs of any clinical or diagnostic hospital materials or signage or anything like that. So they're intended to provide what hospitals and the health service can't really provide. But they're also really places where architects can express a kind of thesis about architecture, but also put everything into making architecture sort of proactive in the idea of well-being, and as Charles Jenks calls it, the architecture of healing and the architecture of hope. So it's a very, it's a kind of big responsibility to be given a commission to design a Maggie's, because the architecture itself is supposed to act to help people feel better while they may be dying or fighting cancer. So I was asked to design Maggie's in Taunton. Is a relatively small town in Somerset, and there's a huge hospital here, the Musgrove Park Hospital, and they agreed. Well, most hospitals really want a Maggie's, because any hospital that has an oncology department and has radiation and chemotherapy as a service, they really can't provide the services that Maggie's provide as a charity and as a free service. So Musgrove Park Hospital is one of these big, completely unplanned and confusing places, and we were very lucky that we found this beautiful open recreation ground and playing fields right on the border of the hospital, and with the Maggie's team chose that as our site. And so this is the site here. So you can see, there's a kind of funny building here from the 80s, but there's a kind of massive hospital buildings behind. But when you're in this site, you look out onto the hills, the Blackdown Hills. One of the interesting things about working in Somerset are there are great sort of country estates and monasteries and abbeys, and this is Glastonbury Abbey, and we found this really interesting kitchen that acts as a kind of pavilion on the wall of an estate, which you can see here. And the principle of the kitchen being at the heart of the Maggie's, and with doors in all the corners, it was a kind of interesting precedent for us. But we really sort of pulled apart the typology of the house, of the block, which you can see here, the kind of program. They're all about 300 square meters. So we thought, let's pull it apart so the hearth and the cooking and the kitchen is in the center, and all of the supporting spaces are wings. And between each of these wings, you have a garden. So the garden becomes part of the space, but it also provides acoustic separation between rooms. And then the front of this planform becomes a series of verandas overlooking the park. So in a way, the project is about three different references. The idea of a vessel, of the offering that you offer. It's a place of welcome, and so the approach to the kitchen is the most important journey. That the building acts as a kind of pavilion, like a cricket pavilion overlooking the park, so it contributes to the public use of the park and sense of safety. And then the leaf as a roof form, as an element that collects water. It's a very rainy place and it's prone to flooding, so water management is really crucial. So this is one of my initial sketches. So really trying to convey a lightness that it sort of hovers above the landscape, and has this relationship of small pavilions, like a cluster of pavilions around a central hall, and these are the three verandas. So you approach from the Beacon Center along a garden path, you go past the building to approach the entrance. You can see in as you approach. Apparently it's quite daunting for cancer patients to come to Maggie's for the first time, so that the approach is really important, a place to pause and gather yourself before you go into the main space, which is a big kitchen, double height. And then on the first floor, a big void to create a double height hall, and more counseling spaces and offices. So a very simple program, but because our site was sort of poised on this edge, it had this opportunity to have a kind of panoramic outlook. And these are show how the building sits. It hovers a little bit above the ground. There's a ha-ha to separate the garden from the park, and native species to Somerset from our landscape architect. These are our images of this journey. So the approach through the garden to the entrance pavilion, a palette of aluminium and glass and stone and timber. It's a timber structure primarily. And so when you enter it's unfurnished in all these renders, it's very early stages, but the idea is that you're walking really through a grove of trees, even when you're in the building, and that your relationship to the exterior is always filtered. And this is the view from the kitchen, so the kitchen island is really important. So this idea of screening between the main gathering space and the playing fields is really important. And then the roof, because it's cupped, is kind of like a belly that hovers over the space. And then this is going to be the library on the right. And then one of the counseling rooms, so you can sort of have multiple layers of transparency and translucency. This is the sense that we're hoping to achieve with this building, that it does act as a kind of guardian over the park, but also as a very sheltering and practically ephemeral place that offers that service. I thought I would finish with a short film, which is just about my installation at the Venice Biennale, which is called Recasting. And in a way, this installation summarizes a lot of what I've been talking about in this talk. So that tall totem, it's the cloister from Exeter College turned vertically. So when you lie down on the platform at the bottom and look up, you get the same spatial effect as the cloister in Oxford. And there's a mirror at the top, so it makes it look like there's two cloisters. I think one of the things I'm really interested in working with is optical illusion, and it's one of the things that I think Baroque architects are very much about, but in the service of ecclesiastical effects. But I think the use of mirrors is really important in a lot of what I've done, just to sort of amplify the effects of the architecture, and just creating those compressed and forced perspective moments to really intensify how you experience a place, and really working with light. So I think mirrors have had a kind of, bad rap for the last 20 or 30 years, but I think when they were first invented, they were really used architecturally and in beautiful and really effective ways. That niche is very much, in a way, the device of pulling light in from above and washing a wall to create that sort of sense of otherworldliness. This is the totem that is about inhabited edges, which is the moment when you stand on a balcony or sort of halfway between inside and outside in a building and get to experience that kind of what I think is a very poignant place somewhere between the interior and the exterior, between architecture and the landscape. You probably know about the Venice Biennale, the theme of free space, that this principle of generosity and kind of civicness in every project that architects offer to freely when they design is a kind of critical aspect of our work. This is the Arsenale and the Venice Biennale, and the pink dots are what are the site that I was given in the first space. This was the kind of concept proposal drawing of 4 totems, each of which was to represent a different aspect of free space in housing. Grafton Architects asked me to address the subject of housing with my installation. Basically consists of a platform with these 4 totems, each of which offers a very direct physical experience of these key moments of free space in my housing, being threshold, and you'll recognize the arches from King's Cross, roof space, passage, and inhabited edge. And I'll let the film speak for itself, but these are the projects that these totems reference. These are our initial renders, also using the context of the Arsenale as, so the window of the building itself becomes part of the experience of our installation. It was all made of plywood from Spain, really lightweight plywood called Garnica. These are some of the technical drawings. This arch, my idea was to create something that you would normally expect to be very massive and load-bearing, a compressive structure, and make it disappear. So it's a kind of dissolving arch. That was all about the screws in the wood. All the shims and the screws are what holds it all together. We worked with Arab on this structure, and also had to remove weight by cutting big holes in the fins of the arches. Really, it was about trying to make an arch made of light. And so another kind of oxymoron that I like to work with. And we had a really fantastic contractor, woodworker outside Oxford, who made it all in their workshop with incredible precision. I just thought it was really nice in the Biennale that the recasting installation was really enjoyed by children. I think it's a really good test of architecture when children enjoy the spaces you make. And on the right, that's Peter Cook and his wife Yael enjoying that moment under that zenithal light. And I'm just going to leave you with three little words of advice. Love your archetypes, also for architecture students who are in the room. Create the context. It's not just about creating an object that inhabits a context. It's about creating context with your architecture, thinking about the future generations who will come and work alongside you. And most important of all, express joy in your work. Thank you.